Good morning, everybody. Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to talk about Sarah's death and Abraham's death, the end of an era in the book of Genesis, as we continue to read through it together this morning. Mitch brings us in, though. We'll see you in a minute.
Every trial feeds me with the living bread.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Again, we welcome you to the Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Been working our way through the book of Genesis. This morning we turn our attention to the death of Sarah and the death of Abraham, the end of an era. If you've been reading through the book of Genesis, you know that we started the story of Abraham and Sarah in verse 1 of chapter 12 when God calls them out of the land of the Ur of Chaldeans. We've been with them throughout the majority of their time in the land of Canaan, even last week and yesterday, Yesterday we talked about how Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, and God provided a sacrifice, a substitute. Now we turn our attention to the death of Sarah at 127 years old and Abraham at 175. Here we go, verse 1 of 23. Now Sarah lived 127 years. These were all the years of her life. Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abram went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Then Abraham got up from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. I am an alien residing among you. Give me burial property among you so that I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Listen to us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in our finest burial place. None of us will withhold from you his burial place for burying your dead. Then Abraham rose and bowed down to the Hittites, the people of the land, and he said to them, If you are willing for me to bury my dead, listen to me and ask Ephron, son of Zohar, on my behalf to give me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him. It is at the end of his field. Let him give it to me in your presence for the full price as burial property. Abraham is mourning the death of his beloved wife Sarah. She dies after 127 years. Isaac's 37 when she dies. And she dies at 127 years old. People lived a little longer back then. And Abraham mourns her loss. He loves her. He wants to bury her. He wants to give her the proper burial. He wants to have a piece of property to bury her. I think this is important for us in the modern world. The human body is a very important thing. God creates the human body. We're not trying to escape the human body to get to the spiritual realm. God creates the human body. The faith that we have is a spiritual faith in the Lord, but it is lived out in the physical world. And we will be reunited with our physical bodies in the last day in the resurrection of the dead. And so while these bodies will decay, our souls will depart and be with the Lord, and Sarah's soul departed to go be with the Lord. Her body was important. Her body was valuable. Her body was a sign of the creativity and the majesty of God. And Abraham wanted to bury her properly. And so that's what he does. And so he wants to honor her even in her burial. He goes and finds a burial place. God provides for him through the Hittites who believe that Abraham was a prince of God. And so they're willing to give him a burial place. And Abraham wants to honor her death and honor her in her death and in her burial. Then we skip over to chapter 25, and we read this about Abraham himself. This is the length of Abraham's life, 175 years. He took his last breath and died at a good old age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. This was the field that Abraham bought from Hittites. Abraham was buried there with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who lived near Beer Lahai Roi. So what we have is Abraham dying at 175 years. Isaac 75, he and Ishmael come together and bury their father. Presumably they have a relationship that extends and continues on, and they get together and bury their father. And again, they want to honor him, and they bury him in the same place that Sarah is buried, husband and wife buried together. Abraham lived another number of years after Sarah, but when he was dead, he was sent and buried with his beloved wife, Sarah. I think there is something important here that Seasons come and season goes. Lifespans come and lifespans go. We all will face at some point the reality of death. Our loved ones will die. We will die should the Lord tarry until after our death. Life goes on. But the significance of these stories in the Bible, I think, are important because, one, it tells us that our days are numbered. Two, it tells us that we are responsible while we are living to honor and glorify God. Three, it tells us that the faithfulness of God is what carries his purposes and his people onward. It'd be very easy to read these stories of the Bible and even to go through experiences in our own life and think because someone great has died or because someone who held the faith has died that it is the end. It's the end of an era, but it doesn't mean that God's work and God's will won't continue. God used Abraham. Abraham had his faults for sure. But he was a man of faithfulness, a man of obedience, a man who learned through his life. And it's interesting when you study the life of Abraham and Sarah, early on they make a lot more mistakes than they do later on. It's this understanding throughout the Bible of what we call sanctification, this idea that the more we walk with God through faith, the more like God we will become. The more we trust him through every moment of every day, and the more we learn from when we don't trust him, the more faithful we will be as we get older. The idea is that we should be more faithful toward the ends of our lives after having walked with the Lord than we were at the beginning. We're going to have ups and we're going to have downs. We're going to have challenges. We're going to make major issues and faults. We see that happen throughout the story of Abraham. He lied about his wife and got in trouble in Egypt. He did the exact same thing later on when he went into another area with Abimelech. We see Abraham God coming and saying, I'm going to make your name great through an offspring, and Sarah and Abraham trying to have children, can't have children because of infertility issues. God has chosen not to open Sarah's womb, and so Sarah and Abraham concoct this plan that Sarah's going to give Abraham Hagar, and Abraham and Hagar are going to have a sexual relationship, and the offspring of that sexual relationship is going to be the son through whom God's going to bless the world. And that Ishmael is born, and we know all the problems that come as a result of that, and the people of the Middle East are still dealing with those issues. But yet God is working through Abraham, and then we get to Genesis 22, which we already read this week, and he's willing to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the one through whom the blessing is going to come. Abraham walks with God and becomes more and more faithful, and that's the challenge for you and me. Our lives and our days are numbered. Our lives will come to an end. The question is, what are we doing with our lives to honor and glorify God? The human body is as important as the soul. God created both, and God united them together, and we will be united with our bodies when the return of Christ, and that the kingdom of God, the work of God, will continue on even after we're gone, and those who are heroes in our faith and our lives are gone, because God is the one upon whom the faith depends. And the challenge for us is to become more faithful the older we get as we walk with the Lord. Maybe that's the challenge for you today. How can you become more like Jesus, more faithful every step of the way as you walk with the Lord and prepare yourselves to go be with him one day? You guys take care. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.
You care.